Reporters for Vice News travel the world, putting a human face to the world's most important stories.
There's a solid wall of riot police officers.
But now, we introduce you to them.
They're doing CPR on one of the casualties here. We don't know who's going to make it.
This is Field Notes, a show that sits down with our reporters to find out the stories behind their stories and how they got so close to the action.
Feeling pretty good about that?
In this episode, we talk to the team that got inside Colombia's protest movement to see how people with only a few shields and rocks have stood up to armed police.
Go.
Usted saca una cacerola de su casa y empieza a darle, eso al presidente no le importa. Usted hace un paro de un día, al presidente no le importa. Entonces, ¿por qué nos toca resistir? Porque así no hay abastecimiento, ya sea gasolina, comidas y demás. Entonces ya el Estado empieza como a centrarse en nosotros.
David, Juanita, thank you for joining me. I realize you're a couple weeks out of being in Colombia and reporting on this story. David, let me start with you. Can you explain to me why you were reporting on this youth movement, what the story was, and how that reflects what's happening in Colombia right now?
Yeah, of course. So we are a team of 3 people from Colombia. I'm half Colombian. The other 2 people on the team are fully Colombian. We were all born there and grew up there. And we all also cover Latin America to varying degrees. So for various reasons, we were paying attention to what was happening in Colombia. But I was paying attention to this national strike from before it was declared, because the last time that a national strike was declared in 2019, it wound up turning into a huge protest movement, was repressed violently by the police. Basically everything that we're seeing now, but on a smaller scale. So when I learned that they were declaring a new one, I was like, okay, we need to pay attention to that, because there is a pre-existing sort of tinderbox that has caught fire before. Let's see if it happens again. And sure enough, it did in a huge way. So as the protests got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the police violence got worse and worse and worse, between the 3 of us, we were just talking about it, and we're kind of like, okay, it like became increasingly clear that we had to go, right? It wasn't like a, do we do this or not? It was like a, when do we do this and what's the angle? And we, between the 3 of us, we talked about it as like an obligation in fairly explicit terms, that we needed to go beyond the ground covering what was happening, because it was increasingly clear that it was a very big story for Colombia with long-term repercussions, the outlines of which I think people were and still are only beginning to really discern.
And Juanita, given how much news has happened internationally over the last couple months, this is a story, what's happening in Colombia, that hasn't really gotten a ton of international attention. Can you outline what's at stake for the people on the streets, why it's so combative, and how you guys went about trying to tell that story?
I mean, it's a different protest because it's lasted for, it's been more than a month. And I think for the first time, young Colombians are seeing that they're getting attention. There's been protests. There was a round of protests in 2019, and it lasted for a couple of weeks. But now they've been able to keep, to stay in the streets. And it's usually in Bogota, it's in different cities, and you see them, popping up constantly. And so I think they know that not necessarily the whole country supports them, but I think, the movement was started by young people, and they know that, people like older people, like also supporting them. And so I think they know that finally they're getting the attention that they need, and what they want is opportunity. It's a country where there's a huge gap between the people who have, money, the people who can afford to go to school, the people who can afford, to like live a normal life, and the people who work every single day can barely afford to go to school. Even if they work, 7 days a week, it's really hard for them to just buy the basic things. And so they know that this is the opportunity that they have for the country, and hopefully people outside the country to listen to them. This story got a lot of attention the first 2 weeks outside of Colombia. And so they know that hopefully people are now watching. And I think now it's beyond just getting the opportunities that they need. Now it's also about accountability. because of, the number of people who have been killed by police.
Right, and so that's sort of the step two. David, can you tell me on the step one, this is a protest movement that is about economic opportunity, that is about asking for the government to work for young people. What is it that these young people are asking for?
One of the things that makes it remarkable is the extent to which it's actually a cross-sector protest movement that includes various different parts of Colombian society that have protested independently for many years, really coming together in a way that is truly remarkable, right? So that's everything from labor unions, who initially declared the national strike, that's why it was declared in those terms, to the urban poor, to indigenous and Afro-descendant groups, to peasant groups, right? All of these sort of social sectors really are in fact coming together in the streets in a physical sort of sense, but also in terms of sort of aligning their interests and their demands. That said, the most visible group, the group that is putting the most on the line in terms of their physical livelihood, are urban youth, and specifically poor and working class urban youth. This is a class that sees itself in the context of Colombian society as basically having no place, no opportunity for advancement, no opportunity for education, access to basic services like healthcare is extremely limited and difficult to come by. And what this protest movement has done is given them not only a means to obtain the sort of attention that the basic level of attention that they need, but also it's given them a cause, right? It's given them sort of like something to live for when otherwise the society that they belong to doesn't see them as particularly valuable or worthy. They are now seen as by large segments of the society, as some of the most heroic, worthy members of society. That has the potential to completely change a person's view of themselves in the world, in a very radical sense. And that's happening to countless young people in cities all across Colombia.
Now, talking about accountability, the state violence that has been just deployed against many of the people who are protesting has been pretty brutal. So what did you guys see? What did you hear from people? And why is it that these demands that this protest movement are putting forth are being met with live ammunition?
It's interesting. One of the first things we saw is that once there is visible international press on the street in one of these sort of situations of confrontation between police and protesters, the police hold way back. And this is something that the frontline kids kept telling us over and over and over again. So it's hard to actually see the most violent end of the spectrum of what happens. But fortunately, everybody has a cell phone now, so there's plenty of videos of it. We did see a fairly typical example of the Colombian National Police's dedicated riot squad, which at this point is extremely controversial and has a horrible human rights track record, in action, which is sort of, their sort of arsenal of less lethal munitions, like stun grenades, tear gas, rubber pellets, which they deploy in various ways that they're not supposed to, right? So they're supposed to fire these sorts of munitions up into the air so that they land amongst the protesters, not directly at protesters, which is how people lose eyes and it's how people die. But they routinely fire them directly at protesters, and we saw that multiple times. We also saw, for example, the sort of shotgun rounds that get filled with supposedly rubber pellets. They were filling them with marbles, glass marbles. People kept gathering them and showing them to us. We ourselves found them on the ground after this, in the midst of this violent encounter between protesters and police. We spoke to doctors and nurses who were volunteering as medics in these frontline barricades, who told us about the various different wounds that they see on a regular basis, which is everything from bullet wounds to people who have lost eyes, to people with sort of severe fractures. And then there's a whole other level that is really just beginning to be investigated, and which is something that, I think it's like the next step in this story, which is this stuff that happens off the streets. You know what I mean? Because there are a lot of arbitrary detentions that are happening. The police are picking a lot of people up, a lot of people who are still missing, right? People don't really know where they are. And that's all obviously much more difficult to access because it's happening behind closed doors in police stations and clandestine detention centers and that kind of thing.
What is bringing the temperature this far up when it's about, the demands seem to be economic?
Because people are not going away, they're still blocking streets or blocking main roads. We were in Cali and we drove, I think, about 2 hours, and we went to, a very strategic place. That place connects Colombia's main port to the rest of the country. And so they know that by blocking that, they're not letting any trucks through. And there was like a, back and forth between like the protesters and the police squad. So they don't want to leave. They're going to keep protesting. And that's why, the police are using whatever they have available to try and, get them to go home. And, I think they're just going to keep doing it because there's no consequences.
How many people have been killed? Do we know?
It depends on who you ask. There's one particular NGO called Temblores, which is doing, I think, the most detailed rigorous work on this question. They count upwards of 40 people that they've been able to confirm, and then an additional 20 to 30 that they're working on confirming. It's hard to keep track, to be honest, because the strike is ongoing and the violence is ongoing. But we're talking about, at minimum, 40 people, and almost certainly substantially more than that.
Now let's zoom out historically a little bit and think about where Colombia is at this moment. Obviously, a few years ago, there was a peace deal that ended a 4-decade-long civil war. So is this effectively a case of like the infrastructure of domestic war being turned from the, rural hinterlands to young people, or, people in the streets of cities?
Colombia has evolved around the civil war in a number of ways that are now expressing themselves. So to start, all policing in Colombia is done by the national police. There is a singular police force. It's not like the United States or Mexico where you have a municipal police and a state police and a federal police and there's different agencies. It's like it's all the national police, which, as you yourself said, for the last more than half century, has been geared towards fighting a civil war. Beyond that, the national police is within the Department of Defense, the Colombian Ministry of Defense, right? It's not within the Ministry of the Interior or some other ministry that is a civilian ministry, right? It is not it's theoretically, it's a civil police department. That's what separates it from the actual armed forces. And yet it is, in practice, yet another wing of the armed forces.
Right, and so the hangover, so to speak, of a militarized internal police force, that is an institutional memory that is now being enacted in real life again. What do people in Colombia who aren't on the streets, who are, not part of the protest movement necessarily, how are they perceiving what's going on?
Yeah, I think there's a divide. You have the people who fully support what's happening, but then you also have a group, and there's, for them, what's happening, it's inconvenient because, there's the grocery stores, like they can't find the products that they usually buy, or because they can't get to work, or because, and this is, I think it has to do a lot with local media. There's only a couple, and unfortunately, for the most part, they're only reporting one side of the story, which is like, what the government is trying to say, that, these are terrorists, like these people are criminals, they don't want to work and they're just doing this to cause trouble. And so unfortunately, you have these two groups, one that supports what's happening and the other one that's fully against it. If someone gets killed, it's because, they're in the streets and they're blocking the streets and they're blocking the main roads, and they shouldn't be doing that. And so I think that's just making it more and more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Now, is that something internally that's changing at all? Like, does that narrative get disrupted or upset by, young people speaking out? International media paying attention to it?
I think that's why our piece got so much attention in Colombia. We interviewed the Minister of Justice, and he did say on camera that most of the deaths had not been caused by the protests or during the protests, or unrelated events.
En términos muy básicos, algo que acaba de decir, ¿usted reconoce o no que ha habido decenas de muertos durante este paro nacional? y muertos que según varios observadores fueron a las manos de la fuerza pública.
No me consta, pero lo que sí me he podido leer y documentar es que muchos muertos no han sido como consecuencia del paro que ha habido. Son hechos aislados en el cual se presentan por riñas callejeras, por intento de hurto, de robo, etc.
But then when people watched our piece, people who maybe hadn't taken the time to like actually understand why these young people are protesting, like I think that was, you know, that affected them, or like that actually made them stop and pay attention to what's happening. So I think it's mostly because of what's being published outside of the country, not necessarily what, you know, mass media is covering in Colombia, like, you know, the nightly news. There's a couple independent magazines and like online publications that are actually, you know, are covering the other side of the story, and that's also helped, you know, people understand. But I think for the most part, it's been, you know, by international coverage.
When you look at the polling, a very large percentage of people supports the national strike and disapproves of the government. It's a remarkably popular movement. And it's a remarkably unpopular government, right? It's what I keep thinking of it as like a genuine crisis of legitimacy for the current president and his administration. But at the same time, even amongst the people who support the national strike and support the motives of the national strike, there is the blockades, the barricades, the actual blocking of roads and disrupting of transport corridors and things like that is also very unpopular, right? Like a lot of people disapprove of that. So there's this strange contradiction where people are like, I support the right to protest and I support like this uprising, but I don't necessarily support its tactics. And yet those tactics are not turning me towards the side of the government. It's like I'm still against the government and in favor of the national strike, even if I am inconvenienced by and disapprove of their most disruptive tactics, right? And that combination of factors, I think, reflects a deep and very remarkable shift in a country that is historically very conservative. There's a sort of like instinctive siding with authority and siding with public order and siding with the government and against any kind of disorder, anything that could be seen as being adjacent to the insurgency, right? That's clearly changing. The way that the public is reacting to this, the number of people who are just like opposed to the national strike and say these kids are vandals and they must be crushed and they make excuses for them being killed in the street, that group of people is increasingly small and I think increasingly isolated and sort of increasingly retrenched. And people increasingly see them for what they are, which is mostly urban rich people, right? And also like huge rural landholders, basically the ruling elites, right? Like the tiny ruling elites that this protest movement is against and has been from the beginning.
Right, and partly the government is responding with a framework that is of another era, so to speak, right? It's the
yeah, for sure.
It's the playbook from the Civil War, effectively.
Because they're responding so single-mindedly and stubbornly with that same mindset is a part of the reason why the national strike has been going on for over a month now. And why? Because they keep not recognizing the very basic legitimacy of it as a popular uprising, right? They refuse to recognize it as legitimate. It is purely the result of conspiratorial criminal actors, and that's why it must be crushed, right? So that kind of stubbornness just pisses people off more, and that cycle continues, and people keep going to the streets, and people keep blocking highways, and people keep getting killed, right? Like that's very much what's happening.
The violence is really shocking and like upsetting, but is there some feeling of like, wait, maybe this is like a new time that Colombia can sort of figure out some of its economic problems and people's human potential and capital can be utilized and not just sort of shunted to the side?
Yeah, there is hope. There's definitely hope. And I think that there are a lot of people in Colombia who are looking at what's happening with a sense of excitement and also trepidation, right? It's like the relationship of the conflict to what's happening now, it's not like the peace process as in the conflict ending. It's actually the failure of the peace process and the government's failure to meet its end of the deal and the fact that the conflict hasn't ended that is contributing to so much of what's happening right now. So even though it emerges from this situation of desperation, both economic desperation and desperation with this just never-ending violence, it is new, right? We're just not used to seeing a social movement like this in Colombia, in a place that's usually so mired in war. We're not used to seeing a social movement like this that has already had success, right? They toppled a minister, they've toppled a couple of big reforms in Congress. So it's kind of like, this is new. And simply by virtue of it being new and it not being the war, right? And it not being all of the old ways of doing politics, it is exciting and hopeful to people.
I think it's going to depend on like next year's election, like who's going to be the next president. The people who are in power now, they've been in power for years. So there needs to be a change in who's in power, I think, for the country to actually change. Because if if the same people are in power, then it's not really going to change much. And they're going to be able to, crush this movement, or like I think it's just going to, people are just eventually going to go home, and we're just going to keep, going through the same cycle of like, a couple protests every now and then, and it's just going to go back to what it's been.
The political system, is it robust enough to kind of subsume some of these concerns and make it not about a strike, but about legislation, about reform? Like, are there political parties that are like, okay, cool, we get it. We see what you're saying. Let's try to enact this at a governmental level.
Yeah, there is a relatively robust electoral left wing in Colombia, particularly since the end of the conflict, or sort of since the peace process. But it's not the same thing as the protest movement, right? And I think that one of the big questions, this is pretty inside baseball, but I do think that the question of how the sort of Colombian institutional electoral left absorbs, or perhaps in some ways co-opts, the energy that's in the streets is a really big question. And it could either take the movement into its next stage, or it could sap the life out of it.
Well, and you say that's inside baseball, but that's kind of the story of a lot of social movements around the world, and specifically in the United States.
For sure.
So how did the energy on the streets
Definitely.
from younger people, for the most part, get translated into institutional changes that they want to see because they've got most of their lives left to live? I understand you guys are going to be on this story. It's not like it's over, right?
It is not over.
I look forward to seeing more reporting on this, guys, and thank you for paying attention to it. Great to see you and to talk with you as always.
Thank you, Krishna.
Thank you.